EPA-FAKE-CERCLA, Part 8, Trespassers, Receptors. In Part 7, the conversation dealt with Dexter Matthews, Chief of Division of Waste Management for NC Diener, and what he had stated regarding the history of the CTS site. And the big news was what happened on June 18, 1990. Matthews stated that the Division of Waste Management received a resident's concerns of contamination at the CTS site and potential drinking water well impacts. Matthews stated that on June 18, 1990, Division of Waste Management sends a letter documenting those concerns to EPA contractor NUS and to EPA Region 4. The concerned resident was David Ogren. He had called the Buncombe County Health Department and later spoke with Miss Robin Purcell. She's with Hazardous Waste Section. Ms. DeRosa had filed a memo detailing a conversation she had had with Ms. Purcell. She even referenced the EPA CERCLA ID number of NCD 0031495556. It was in writing. What are the consequences for the written warnings and the consequences for ignoring the RICEs? It was all there in black and white, text on paper, detailing a call from Dave Ogren, Ogren Industries. Mr. Ogren lives in the area. Mr. Ogren was concerned about an old chemical pond which used to be at the CTS property. He said that the property was about to be sold or had just been sold, and he was concerned that the contaminated areas on site might not be cleaned up. He also said that a well had recently been installed on the adjacent residential property. This property is owned by Larry Rice. Dave Ogren said that after the well was put into use, the owners began having health problems. He said that the well was contaminated. And Pat DeRosa of the State CERCLA Branch Superfund Section sent those warnings to EPA and their contractor on June 18, 1990. Here's the memo. Ms. DuPont, please find enclosed a recent telecon and a copy of the site assessment report for the subject site. I hope this will be useful to your staff in completing their site investigation. It was for CTS of Asheville, NCD 0031495556. In writing, forewarned. And it came straight from the head of the CERCLA branch for the Superfund section for the state of North Carolina, Ms. Pat DeRosa. Imagine being the Rices or Robinsons. Imagine how it must feel to be betrayed like this. 1 week after the warning, June 25, 1990, EPA Region 4 conducted its first sampling. 8 days after the written warning, EPA Region 4 trespassed onto the Rice property. And this is what EPA Region 4 has been trying to hide. EPA Region 4 has been trying to hide that and the fact that a $30 million subdivision went up on the plant property. That's across the street. That's where Norman Lewis lived. That's the Rice's property there. That's Larry Jr.'s house. And you can imagine what things would have been like early in the morning on June 26, 1990, as they mobilized to take the second day's sampling. They would have come out onto Mills Gap Road just before 9:30 in the morning and taken a right. And they would have driven just a couple of hundred yards to the very next driveway for the Rice property. On the way, they would have passed by these homes here where the residents had passed away from brain cancer. And they would have turned right down this dirt driveway. They would have made their way down to take a sample. The question is, why exactly would they have gone onto the Rice property to begin with? Why exactly would they be some 350 feet away from the building itself, about a 25 to 30 foot drop in elevation slope? Why exactly would they do that? Why would they pick this area right here to test? And how could they not have seen Terry Rice's house? And how could they have not verified his water source? EPA officials drove down Mills Gap, turned right onto the Rice property, drove down to take this sample. It was the second sample that EPA had conducted on June 26, 1990. The giveaway was under the rationale for sample locations. Samples were being collected to determine the extent of migration of contaminants from the CTS facility. What else can be deduced? They knew it was migrating. That's why they went looking for it, and they were finding it. CaSDO2 was the trespassing sample. A sediment sample was collected from a small stream draining the east side of the property. That's the CTS property at a depth of 0 to 2 feet, collected to determine the extent of sediment contamination down gradient of the site. June 26, 9:30 a.m. Trespassed. Didn't bother to tell them. And what did they find with the sample? 1,100 parts per billion of dichloroethylene. Dichloroethylene is a known degradient of trichloroethylene. And their map details the fact that CaSDO2 was taken at the pipes. Is it any wonder that David Dorian, former emergency on-scene coordinator for the removal branch from Region 4, removed this file along with all the other files in the administrative record in 2007? What didn't they want people to know? Well, it's right there. And how could they not have known? EPA Region 4 was sampling in 1990 for migrating contaminants, toxins that were releasing, and they found them. And they did nothing about it. Nothing for 9 years. And we all know the response that came in 1999, don't we? EPA Region 4 officials led by Don Rigger did not want people to know what had happened in 1990. They did not want people to know that Terry Rice had been left drinking that water for 9 extra years, that Larry Rice Jr. had been left and his family drinking that water for an additional 9 years. They didn't want people to know that CaSDO2 was a sample obtained through trespassing, a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment that protects against illegal search and seizure, and this was just the beginning of a history of violating the Rices and abusing them. It is truly unconscionable that no one knocked on Terry's door to ascertain his water source in 1990 on June 26th, that no one ever bothered to tell them of the test results after that sample in June of 1990.
How can you justify leaving the Rice family on that property if you deemed it a hazardous waste site, or is it a Superfund site? How can you leave a family sitting on a site that you have already declared is a hazardous waste site? Why should that family not be relocated?
No, a couple things. I was personally involved in the screw up to have 2 sites, and I can tell you how it happened. I'm sitting in Atlanta. I don't remember the date. Somebody read me something today. I think it was in August of 1999. I was on call for emergency response. The phone rang, and it was somebody from Jim's office, and they had data from drinking water, a spring and a well up here that was hot. And when we get that, the first thing we do is get the people on bottled water until we can figure out a more permanent solution, which in this case was to hook them up to city water. Well, I'm sitting there in Atlanta. I don't know. All I know is the address of where we need to take the bottled water. I don't know that CTS is next door. I didn't have the benefit of that. So I wrote on the procurement request for the bottled water, Mills Gap Road site. That's what I called it. And that got it its own number and everything else. And so, that's a mistake, and that's how it happened.
Just a goofy screw-up, huh? Well, that's odd, because you don't create CERCLA sites off of water procurement forms. You had to put a street address down. You had to enter in longitude and latitude coordinates. And even though Miss Rice was 20 feet away, she never got to hear the words, "I'm sorry." Mr. Rigger and Mr. Stroud put down 273 Mills Gap Road for that CERCLA site called Mills Gap Road Groundwater Contamination Site. They put that on Dot Rice and Larry Rice's property at 273 Mills Gap Road. Yep, we reported it, and we've reported it, and we've reported it, and we're going to keep on reporting it. If the screw-up was over where to deliver bottled water, shouldn't it have been 275 Mills Gap Road? Shouldn't it have been for Terry Rice's house, or maybe even Larry Rice Jr.'s? His address is 277 Mills Gap Road. Nope, you put it down as 273 Mills Gap Road for that CERCLA site. That's Dot and Larry Sr.'s house. Yet the water procurement form does say that 275 is supposed to get the water. So how would you possibly be able to explain that mistake? The screw-up defense doesn't cut it. For the latitude and longitude coordinates, EPA Region 4 put 35.491604 for the latitude, and for longitude, minus 82.502482. Wonder where that is. You think that's at 235 Mills Gap Road? Mr. Rigger, the address for the bottled water was 275 and 277 Mills Gap Road. You put Mrs. Rice's 273 address for the Mills Gap Road groundwater contamination CERCLA site. Then you guys gave it a GPS location that pushed that fake CERCLA site even further away from the original CTS of Asheville CERCLA site. It was a toxic disaster. It was emanating waste, and you knew it back then in 1999, and you knew it in 1990 at EPA Region 4. Yet you pushed it even further away from Southside Village, and you never told the Rices. Mr. Rigger and Mr. Stroud used an incident that never occurred in August of 1999 to create that fake CERCLA site. That's what's been alleged. That's what we have demonstrated. Rigger and Stroud sent a fake incident through the U.S. Coast Guard National Response Center on August 23rd for an event that never happened on August 21st. Obfuscation through bifurcation. And for the Rice family, it's still a toxic disaster. It comes from the CTS of Asheville site, and it comes into their yard. It still impacts their springs. Currently, the Rice's springs are testing at 14,000 parts per billion for TCE. It came through the pipes. It went into their yard. It impacted their water source in their spring well. EPA Region 4 was warned in writing. It came from the state of North Carolina based on a phone call from David Ogren. And it was sent to EPA on June 18th, 1990. And all our community is asking for is that new officials with no ties to this site, with no ties to officials who have been compromised, step in and take the site over and have the proper removal authority-led response. The contaminants are still coming into the Rice property. The contaminants are still impacting the springs and the surface water and the streams. What more is required? What more basis would anybody need to see this as an environmental justice case, to see this for the threat that it poses to our community, and to see this as an opportunity to redeem EPA Region 4 systemically, to protect other communities who may be harmed by these types of decisions and these types of decision makers, because this crew was more interested in hiding the fact that this Superfund site had gotten away from them, that on their watch it had become a $30 million subdivision on one side, and on the other side they had left the Rice family hanging. They came down here June 26, 1990, just underneath the shadow of the plant, took a sample right here. This was sample CASDO2. And this is where EPA Region 4 trespassed to get that sample, where it said pipes on their map. More on those pipes a bit later. But what else did EPA forget to tell Dexter Matthews? Why isn't the 1989 Field Investigation Team Screening Site Inspection Phase 1 listed? Shouldn't Matthews have known that EPA was there in 1989 for the reconnaissance survey suggested by North Carolina's Mark DeRay? Did EPA fail to mention this to Mr. Matthews? October 1985, DeRay advises EPA to conduct a survey when time allows. This is the recommendation letter written to Denise Bland. It's the final preliminary assessment report for CTS of Asheville, NCD 0031495556. That is EPA's identifying number. Remember, Norman Lewis, the hazardous waste coordinator, is saying there's no problems, nothing disposed of on site or released into the environment at the facility. Nearest residents 500 yards away approximately. The residents use city water. No known drinking wells in the area. Wasn't that convenient? Based on the available data, DeRay said no threat, but you might want to take a look at it in the future. You know, when time allows, have a look. When time allows, because Mr. DeRay said based on the available data that he collected from the hazardous waste coordinator, the site didn't appear to pose a health problem. So in 1989, they found time and did their first site screening. And the first reference from that screening is Mark DeRay's work. With the clarity of hindsight, how much damage is done by doing nothing? August 30th, 1989, Steve Cash, project manager for the screening site inspection phase 1, notifies Mr. Hankey of EPA the results of their assessment. The site is described as 57 acres, partially fenced, the fence enclosing about 10 acres. At the end of the second page, we get to the nitty-gritty. There are 397 residences on wells, another 317 if you go 1 mile out further to 4 miles. The last sentence is the most ridiculous. The distance to the nearest well is about 4,000 feet to the northwest of the site. Reference 5. Reference 5 ought to be good, right? Reference 5 is a U.S. Geological Survey map from 1965. That's how they determined 4,000 feet away for the nearest well. It is critical to note that the surface water runoff from the site is collected by 3 surface storm drain grates located on the northeast corner of the property by the manufacturing facility. Underground drain lines channel water collected by the storm grates into a sewer line. Now the conclusion. Based on the number of people potentially affected and on the above reference factors, FIT 4 recommends that Phase 2 of the screening site inspection be conducted on a high priority basis at the CTS of Asheville, Inc. site. This was from Stephen Cash, and it was approved, and it was copied to Denise Bland, EPA. Low priority to high priority. This was Mark Duray's Potential Hazardous Waste Site Preliminary Assessment Form. It's for CTS of Asheville, NCD 003149556. Lists the site as 57 acres, and it also says that the nearest residents, according to Norman Lewis, were 500 yards away from the plant, also used city water, no known health or environmental threats. Norman Lewis Hazardous Waste Coordinator contact, done by Mr. Mark Duray. This was the RCRA NPL Policy Questionnaire. Remember how they said that they hadn't had any RCRA violations? Here under RCRA enforcement status, they're checking yes for being involved in any other RCRA enforcement action. They're checking yes if they had lost authorization to operate or if they had had their interim status revoked. 1989 Phase 1 was the first hazardous ranking system scoring event. It had one major flaw. One thing we've learned: data is only as good as those who are collecting it and how they input it. In 1989, EPA Region 4 and NUS didn't collect any samples. Once again, we have a desktop screening. Yeah, they came into town and they took a look at the property, but they didn't take any samples. EPA Region 4 did not factor in the surface water route score or the air route score. And what would have happened to their groundwater score if they had factored in the information correctly? What could have changed at that moment? It's one mistake after another mistake. Mistakes aren't illegal. What you do after you found out you made a mistake, that can be illegal, if your actions are. And what difference would calculating a 400-foot target versus a 4,000-foot target? Well, here we go. Number of houses impacted between 0 to 4 miles, 714. Closest well, 4,000 feet away. And where did they get that? From a 1965 USGS map? Nearest well, 4,000 feet away. Nope, the state tested 9 wells in 1999. Those 9 wells were within half a mile of the plant. They were operational in 1989. Despite this, the FIT team recommended a Phase 2 screening site inspection be conducted on a high priority basis. EPA returned June 25th and June 26th of 1990. They had 8 months to verify whether the closest well was actually 4,000 feet away or not. North Carolina Division of Waste Management notified EPA a week prior to their 1990 sampling, and they did it with this June 18th, 1990 memo sent from Pat DeRosa. She was detailing the phone call from Dave Ogren to Robin Purcell. Ogren was concerned about an old chemical pond which used to be at the CTS property. He was concerned that the contaminated areas might not be cleaned up. He also said a well had been recently installed on the adjacent residential property. The property is owned by Larry Rice. Ogren said that after the well was put into use, the owners began having health problems. He said that the well was contaminated. Having it in writing certainly changes the dynamic, doesn't it? Another explanation for why the 1989 Phase 1 event doesn't show up in Mr. Matthews' presentation. Do you think EPA wanted people to know that the site had been screened in 1989 and that they had mishandled the evaluation for groundwater by following this idea that the nearest groundwater well was 4,000 feet away? The 1990 Phase 2 investigation was finalized February 22, 1991, stating the nearest well was identified as 4,000 feet away. This map was part of the withheld 1992 report. EPA withheld 165 of 196 pages. Then EPA pulled the administrative record from the public library. The map was from 1965, and this is how they determined that the closest well was 4,000 feet away. Why not go to the city water department and get a map for all the homes that had water meters A little deductive reasoning would have gone a long way. Then it would just have been a process of elimination, and you'd have known exactly how many people had wells and how many people didn't. EPA went 4,000 feet away to a street that wasn't even on the 1965 map. Number 1 Forest Run Drive was sampled, 4,000 feet away. And that map wasn't even part of the documents in the administrative record, which David Dorian of EPA removed from the PAC library in 2007, just as questions were being asked. The one in the library was 31 pages out of 196 pages. With the pressure of Senator Burr and Congressman Schuler and Senator Hagan, we got a 170-page version. We now have 170 out of 196 pages, which means 26 pages are still missing, and that'd be the field logbook notes from 1990. Don Rigger wasn't missing this map. He received it in August of 1999. It was part of the 46-page document that linked CTS to the disaster that was unfolding 9 years after EPA had been there in 1990. Remember, it was Rigger who said he didn't have the benefit of knowing that CTS was next door to the Rices. How preposterous. This is another map that Don Rigger received. It's from the North Carolina Division of Water Quality. Here they are in 1999, July, identifying 9 wells to sample, all within a half a mile of the CTS plant. 9 wells sampled, all within 2,640 feet, much closer than the 4,000 number. Somehow EPA and NUS thought it was appropriate to go 4,000 feet away, yet when you look at the map from the 1990 sampling, it says that that private well was located 2.5 miles to the north. They couldn't even get that right. 2.5 miles away is 13,200 feet. Now we're not going to forget about those pipes. This is from page 45, 1989. Phase 1 report. It's from a 1980 property map. Notice the 3 drain lines that we talked about, all 3 in the front of the property. They were described as tying into the sewer line. Those are the 3 drain lines. Look what happens when you do an overlay. Remember those pipes? Remember the pipes? We're going to come back to those pipes written on the Rice property from EPA's map. Those are the 3 drain lines that connect into the sewer line that runs down Mills Gap Road. Again, coming out of that overlay, we're going to talk about the pipes. We're going to talk about the pipes that fed to that pond, and we're going to talk about the pipes that were detailed on the Rice property. But first, let's look at the rest of Mr. Matthews' summary regarding EPA's behavior and some of NC Diener's and the Division of Waste Management. Why would EPA withhold its report by 165 pages? It was placed in the PAC library in May 2007. EPA's David Dorian removed it. He removed it after June 16, 2007. Bet he never guessed we'd find it. What was EPA trying to hide? The report was already Bates numbered 165 pages short. There are your motives. They trespassed on the Rice property, took a sample, never told him. And a $30 million subdivision got built on a toxic waste site, and every last bit of that was preventable. This is page 1 of the 1990 Phase 1 report sent to Mr. A.R. Hankey of the Waste Management Division for EPA. Notice the Bates numbering 0001. Page 2, 0002. This is for NCD 0031495556, CTS of Asheville, and it was written by Miss Stephanie Fine of NUS. This is page 3, 0003. Bates number page 0004 is the table of contents. Notice that the summary begins on page 29 and that the references begin on page 30, followed by 3 appendices. Here's page 5, 0005, and it details the tables. Notice the tables are listed in order. Tables 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then on the pages, they also are in corresponding chronological order. And why is that important? Table 1 is found on Bates number 0017. This was the sample and rationale page. Table 1 continued on page 0018. Table 1 continued 0019. Table 2 dealing with the surface water field measurements 0020. Then this page is interesting because it's the last page of this report with text, and it ends in an incomplete sentence. Table 3 is on 0022. Table 3 continued 0023. Table 4 0024. Table 4 continued on 0025. Table 4 continued 0026. Table 8 0027. Table 7, 0028. Table 6, 0029. Table 6 continued, 0030. And Table 5, 0031. No more report. Ends and charts are out of order. Couldn't they have at least Bates numbered it in the right order? Put it back together? Why would they take it apart? Why would they reassemble it out of order? Did EPA honestly think that they could Bates number it 31 pages and people would believe that it ended on page 31 even though it was out of order with the charts, and that the last page with text could end in an incomplete sentence, and that the appendices were missing? How could they possibly think they could get away with that? Oh yeah, that's right, Dave Dorian took it from the library. He was our 6th emergency on-scene coordinator for the removal branch at EPA Region 4. It took pressure from our federal delegation to get a more complete report. We went from having 31 pages total to 170 pages. Took months to get that report. And they still shorted it by 26 pages. Now, that is audacious. And when push came to shove, EPA couldn't even send their own copy. They had to send the state's copy. This is the letter to Pat DeRosa in March of 1991. This is the cover letter that went to the state. Notice the CERCLA stamp. This was from the state of North Carolina, and you can see it in the binding. And you can also tell because there are no Bates numbers. Here we go again with the charts. Now let's look at the state's version, which came from EPA. It was mailed to the state in March of 1991. Table 1, there's the binding from the state, how they put it into their system. And we're going to go down the side, and you'll see that these will flow in chronological order. Table 1, Table 1, Table 2. There's that page that ended in mid-sentence with the EPA's version. We'll show you how it really ends. There's Table 3, Table 3, Table 4, Table 4, Table 4, Table 5, Table 6, Table 6, Table 7. Chronological order, Table 8. There are the pages that we're missing. Here's the first one. There's the end of that sentence. There's page 28, the summary on page 29, page 30, the references, page 31, the references, page 32, and then we get to the appendices. And you get the point. They were missing a lot of pages. First, EPA's legal department denied that the report was any longer than 31 pages. And then they denied it was any longer than 170 pages. And how would we know it was actually longer than that? Take a look at the health ranking system. It was scored by Jennifer Wendell. She was the NPL coordinator. And look at reference 21. Why, that's Stephanie Fine's project manager report. NUS Corporation, February 22nd, 1991, 196 pages. And they're still hanging on to those final 26 pages after denying they even existed, now claiming they can't be found. We already covered in previous documentaries the fact that when the report continued with the missing pages once they were obtained, that mid-sentence is finished. What's important about page 28 of the report, the first page back in, was it was the first time that EPA and NUS were detailing the fact that the migrating contaminant was likely attributable to waste handling practices at CTS. Page 29 was the summary. They said that they found contaminants on site in surface soil, subsurface soil, sediment, and surface water samples in excess of the minimum quantitation limits. They found it all over the place. They didn't sample the groundwater properly, and they didn't sample air, but in everything else they found it. They found it to be pervasive. And then there were the reference pages that finished the report before you get to the 3 appendices that were withheld. Remember that summary. They found it in CASD-03. They found it in CASW-02. They didn't mention what they found on the rice property at CASD-02. Yet somehow, NUS, a Halliburton subsidiary, reached the conclusion that no further remedial action was planned because there was a fence surrounding the source, which is ridiculous because if you notice, the fence was doing nothing to stop the expression of the source. I wonder what the relationship is between Halliburton and CTS Corporation. Wonder who the next victims will be. Unsuspecting purchasers, perhaps? Since 1990, EPA and NCDENR have found contaminants to be widespread in this area. And now, in 2013, we have a new listing. The lower 8 acres, the last vestiges of the original Superfund site where the majority of the toxins have been documented. Now they're documented in the air, the surface water, the sediment, you name it. And it could be yours for just under $1 million, and EPA is doing nothing to stop the sale of that property. Even in the non-aqueous phase liquid sampling investigation, EPA is refusing to do monitoring wells in that area. Perfect for office, retail, or multifamily development, including the contaminants. Please view EPA-FAKE-CERCLA-Part 9, Pipe Dreams.